Hello and welcome to this week's edition of People and Profit. I'm Delano D'Souza filling in for Kate Moody. Coming up this week, we take a look at what comes ahead for the US economy under Joe Biden with the midterm elections now out of the way. And as the COP27 continues in Egypt, developing states hit out at developed nations for climate aid that's been kept out of reach. Now, first, some fundamentals on the state of the US economy. The unemployment rate rose slightly in October and is currently at 3.7%. Inflation, however, remains high, which is why we saw the Fed recently raise interest rates once again this year. Now, year-on-year inflation currently stands at 8.2%, and the debt to GDP ratio currently standing at 124%. We can now bring in Abigail Watt, a U.S. research economist at Aberdeen Standard Investments. Great to have you with us here on the program today. Now, Americans walked in to the midterm elections with wages on the rise, benefits on the rise, but the standard of living wasn't really it wasn't good for most voters. Is this because of the higher cost of energy or supply disruptions which we witnessed during the pandemic?
So there's a number of reasons, I think, why US consumers are perhaps feeling less confident about the US economy and the outlook. I think you've raised an interesting point there, looking at inflation in particular. I think households are starting to feel the kind of pinch from inflation, and as you say, from a number of angles. The first is that kind of supply chain disruption that we saw through the pandemic and the implication of that for rising good prices. And then the second is this idea of disruptions in the labour market in the supply side of the economy for services in particular. And therefore, a lot of households are facing higher costs for kind of the services that they would typically demand too. I would say, though, we did see a little bit of an improvement, particularly on the goods side, in the latest inflation report with that flat on the month. But it is still the case that we are seeing quite strong services inflation, and that's probably something that's weighing on consumer sentiment in the US.
Abigail, we've seen relatively good numbers out of the US economy. Just take a look at the recent unemployment rate at 3.7%. Inflation, however, remains high. Given the actions we've seen from the Fed in the past few months, is a recession inevitable?
So I think you've raised a really key point around the employment rate being very low. In theory, that would be a great thing for the Federal Reserve to have the economy at full employment. I think the issue is that you've got full employment whilst inflation rates are incredibly high. And so the Fed's mandate of 2% inflation, for them to reach that, they need to kind of loosen that labor market. And I think in our view, the one way in which that happens is by having such high rates in the US economy that demand is kind of driven lower. And as you see that demand driven lower and you see kind of, I guess, increased costs for businesses in terms of investment with higher rates, we think that this will lead to a US recession.
But there are some who argue that the governor over there is increasing rates too fast. Where do you stand on that?
We think that the Federal Reserve's policy is what they need to be doing. We actually expect that there'll be further hikes from the Fed to come. We do think at last week's meeting, Powell kind of signaled this desire to maybe shift towards a slower pace of hikes. So we are expecting 2 further 50 basis point hikes from the Fed, one in December and then one in February next year. And we think that is necessary in order to kind of bring inflation rates back in line with their target.
This past August, we saw President Biden sign the Inflation Reduction Act. What kind of benefits can we expect to see in the months to come if global energy prices remain high?
So the Inflation Reduction Act itself, it's interestingly named. I think some of the policies in the long run will benefit in terms of a lack of dependence on energy sources where we've seen, significantly higher prices. And we will see that come through. But this is a very longer term plan. This is a kind of $400 billion plan spread over the next 10 years. And I think the kind of benefits that we see from that will take a long time to kind of be reaped in the US economy. And I actually think the implications are much more at the kind of micro level. And some businesses will be winners and some will be losers from that Inflation Reduction Act package.
Now, we've seen the US President Joe Biden continue on and in some cases even double down on the tougher trade policies of his predecessor, Donald Trump, particularly when it comes to China. Do we know how Beijing could possibly hit back on the economic front?
I think for China, I think front and center for them is their domestic policy. I think, the Chinese economy has been struggling with its zero COVID policy. I think from the 20th Party Congress, we can see that they're kind of shifting and focusing on their own domestic agenda. I think the more interesting side actually is to think about possible further action from the US side. I think the outcome of the midterms will likely lead to more executive actions on kind of foreign policy issues. And I do think China is one of the key areas where we might see more policy making being done by Biden.
And Abigail, what can we expect from the US president on the economic front going forward, knowing full well that he's going to want to create these well-paying jobs, as he's been saying, but at the same time, the Fed will need to do what it has to do to bring down inflation. So both of them are going to be at loggerheads, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think traditionally going into a recession, you would maybe see more fiscal response from the government in the US. But I think part of the issue there is the issues around inflation and the fact that, we've seen such high inflation, and there's been arguments made that some of that inflation might be tied to some of the American Rescue Plan that Biden brought in 2021. And so I think that Biden will be treading very carefully in terms of the amount of fiscal response that's put in place to the recession that we're expecting in the US next year. We should maybe just see kind of automatic stabilizers coming into effect in the economy, such as things like unemployment insurance.
Final question, as historically, economic confidence tended to rise when unemployment fell. Given that there's this sentiment that a recession is looming, why is that the case when unemployment is so low?
So this is a really good question, and it's something that we've kind of been looking into in a little bit more detail. I think one of the key things, as we've already raised, is inflation, and I think consumers have inflation front of mind just now, and I think that's weighing on consumer sentiment. But the other thing that we've seen in a number of the sentiment series in the US is that there's this clear bipartisan split. And I think that sentiment was beginning to decline, even as you saw the kind of big increase in kind of economic activity as the economy reopened in 2021. You saw consumer sentiment was kind of trending down, and I think that this was more to do with Republicans not favoring Biden, and it was more to do with political leanings than necessarily the kind of actual strength of the US economy.
Abigail, thank you very much for joining us on the program today. That was Abigail Watt joining us there from Boston. Now, as the COP27 summit takes place in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, developing countries have hit out at developed states for climate aid that's been kept out of reach. A new report recently released suggested poorer nations will need to secure $1 trillion every year in external financing and match that money with their own funds in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. As the consumption of meat and fish continues to grow around the world, the production of animal feed remains a strain on land and water resources. Insects, however, provide much of the protein animals need at a lower environmental cost. Insect farming has seen a massive expansion here in Europe. France 24's Emerald Maxwell and David Gilbert traveled to one such farm in the north of France.
They may not tickle everyone's appetite, but insects are a natural part of many creatures' diets. Here in Picardy, in northern France, InnovaFeed is betting on the black soldier fly larvae. The company produces insect protein from them, which it sells to fish farms. They say it helps to prevent overfishing, as currently much fish feed is caught at sea.
So that protects fish population. It also reduces CO2 emissions because actually fishing is an energy-intensive business. So we also avoid 800 kilos of CO2 emissions, as was calculated by a third party.
The company also produces insect oil. an alternative source of fats for poultry and pigs.
It's got the same properties as palm oil and coconut oil, and both of them, they tend to happen in tropical countries where there's still a lot of primary forest being felled for it. So we essentially avoid that every time you feed poultry or swine with insect oil instead.
With the promise of a more sustainable source of protein, using less land, water and energy, Innovafeed has raised up to 450 million euros, and it's one of several French startups which are growing fast. It's a market that's supported by research in laboratories like this one in the Paris region into the insect's conversion of waste into high-quality protein.
Their bioconversion is very efficient. 10 kilos of waste becomes 1 kilo of protein.
The protein they produce not only seems to be naturally cleansed of the waste bacteria, but the insect's byproducts are also of interest for plants.
Their excrement or frass becomes a very valuable fertilizer for feeding the soil and plants. So it's really a great example of a circular economy.
Companies like Innovafeed have jumped on board this circular economy, but with demand for animal feed vastly outweighing what these startups are able to supply, insects still have a long way to go to recover their place in a more secure and sustainable food chain.
That's it for this edition of People and Profit. From all of us on the team, thank you very much for watching.
France 24, Your Economy Explained. Liberté, égalité, actualité.